Welcome back to Out of the Fog. Formal hearings for the Dunphy Inquiry started this week, an inquiry which is looking into the shooting death of Don Dunphy, who was killed by a member of former Premier Paul Davis's security detail in April of 2015. Now, my first two guests tonight are two journalists who've been watching this inquiry closely and are here now to weigh in on what has taken place so far and what has really stood out to them. I'd like to welcome back to, of course, the studio, News Director for VOCM, Fred Hutton, and the Telegram's political reporter, James McLeod. Welcome back.
Hello and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Yeah. So I know that both of you have been following this inquiry very closely. I want to start off with Don Dunphy's daughter, Megan. We heard testimony from her, emotional at times, and she brought up a number of questions. I'm curious as to just give us a sense of what that moment was like when all of this started.
Well, it was a fascinating day in that, I mean, for us as journalists, we're immediately drawn to the tears. And a couple times she was very emotional. But almost as striking was sitting there through the day and watching her very matter-of-factly, very candidly speak about her experience on that day and the days and weeks after that. And her testimony raised real questions about, you know, what happened in that house and the investigation that followed by the RCMP that I think we're going to be spending the next month or two teasing apart.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there was this, nobody had really heard from Megan Dunphy, with the exception of some statements through her lawyer, Erin Breen, and to hear her speak, you know, in a couple of days, the day that I was over there, one full day, you look at these witnesses who, they're completely out of their element when they're in this position. There's 11 or 12 lawyers in a semicircle. There's the commissioner, you know, the clerk, there are all the people in the gallery who are watching and people are moving around. I mean, this is totally foreign to most people. Most people will never have to testify at an inquiry like this. I was taken by, in terms of Megan's testimony, about how, I mean, if you want to call it this, what a good witness she was in terms of just her ability to articulate what had happened, these questions that she raised, very legitimate. And, you know, I think that if people who, I don't know, I never met Don Dunphy, but people say he was a pretty feisty guy, and I think that she probably inherited that gene from him in terms of, I'm not backing down from anybody. You can put 25 lawyers up there. This is not going to make me nervous.
Mm-hmm. We heard a lot about his character, of course, from Megan. I guess it was his brother and best friend. What kind of a picture, I guess, did that present that we haven't heard before? So, you know.
Well, for me, perhaps the most telling was, I mean, obviously his brother and this fight that they had. They were next door neighbors. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. There was the peace bond with Richard Dunphy's wife, Debbie, who didn't appear. But, you know, it was Colin Dinn who said that that he was very proud, that Don Dunphy was proud. And he finished that sentence by saying, but he was tormented because he couldn't provide for his family. And when you think about the people who are on workers' compensation, or, you know, what is now, what used to be workers' compensation, and how frustrating it must be to A, not be able to work, and B, not be able to provide for your family. And this is where he basically was, and stuck for so many years in this house, didn't like to take anything free from people, didn't like to get help, just wanted to do it himself, and he couldn't.
Right. James, what stood out for you?
Well, and to Fred's point, like there is, and it probably won't be tackled directly by this inquiry, probably shouldn't be tackled directly by this inquiry, but I don't think there's a journalist in this province who hasn't done at least one story about someone who's on workers' comp, and that is just an absolutely brutal bureaucracy, and it really sends people through the ringer and makes otherwise completely normal people seem like nutcases just because they are at their wits' end. And I mean, that's what we heard about Don Dunphy. I mean, the guy, you know, liked to smoke a bit of weed, liked to watch hockey, loved cats, and to hear the people who knew him describe him, he seemed like a normal, if sort of opinionated and animated guy. But clearly the system he found himself in led him to horrible, tragic end.
Yeah, the perception now is different from the perception that's been out there for a year and a half about, as you say, this person who was just, a nuisance in the community and everything else. Yes, he had his falling out with his family, but it was over like a 20-year period that he'd been dealing with workers' comp, and the pressures associated with that. You hear about his wife dying when his daughter was 3 years old, trying to provide for, the young girl as a single dad, and having this injury and bouncing from job to job and then no job. It would frustrate anyone.
Another one of the testimonies that were heard was from Donna Ivney, and she was a former communications staffer within Premier Paul Davis's government. This all came down to really, it was one tweet that was presented and kind of raised as a flag. But just tell us, I guess, a little bit about what was discussed that day, because there was a trail, but it was one particular tweet that was presented and kind of raised as I guess, to be cautioned.
I will say the first time I read that one tweet in isolation, I was like, oh, that's a pretty scary threat. And then it takes a step back to sort of read those 5 tweets in succession and understand where words are repeated and there's words omitted. There's a lot of the letter C and the letter U instead of those words spelled out. And the grammar's a bit wonky in places. Once you sort of get the message he was trying to convey, it definitely wasn't a threat. And so in that sense, Donna Ivy, who referred this one tweet in isolation to the RNC, she said it would have been difficult to send the whole chain because she was on her BlackBerry and copy and pasting would have been difficult. I mean, it was a screw up. But I mean, any inquiry and any time you end up in a situation where things are this bad, it's not one screw up. Many people did things that perhaps they shouldn't have done, and if they had it to do over, any one of those would have prevented this tragedy. And the whole point of this is, getting a complete story of what happened and identifying those things where, maybe it's a bit more training, maybe it's a different protocol, maybe it's just, changing the way things happen so that these mistakes are never repeated. And
Well, it's interesting to hear Donna Ivy say that there was no policy on social media,
and she brought up the
had
training.
no authority to interpret any of these texts, even though her title is communications specialist.
And she was never trained on threat assessment, or there was no sort of formal briefing on the protective services detail. It was just like, if you see anything you're worried about, send it our way.
Now, of course, this has come to, it's not picking up again until Monday, and that's where you're going to hear from Constable Joe Smyth. Curious as to what, I guess, you're expecting to hear come Monday, because there will be obviously lots of questions, and people want to know, why was that gun fired, and why was it fired, a number of times?
Well, he's the key witness in all of this, obviously. He was the only other person in the room, which, in my opinion, will lead to, the main recommendation out of this is going to be don't send one person alone on a call such as this. I think that other than that, and obviously the way the police investigations were handled, but if you go back and say, okay, we're not going to send one person to something like this to investigate, if there are questions about the person you're going to go talk to, and just do it a different way, or send 2 people, I think that's primarily what's going to come out of this inquiry, aside from however the RCMP may have bungled the investigations or things were done wrong,
Right, because a lot came up in terms of evidence and stuff too. I think Megan brought up some questions in regards to that. But.
Yes, and there are real legitimate questions that were raised about, where was the gun in this whole situation, and Megan Dunphy raised the possibility that evidence was tampered with by Joe Smyth. There's no proof of that. We'll never know what happened in that house.
And not
Again,
looked at
goes
the
back
bullet
to-
that was found
Yes, the bullet.
afterwards, after the fact.
Which is, there's 3 parts to this. There's what happened in the house, which realistically, we can ask all the questions in the world. There were only 2 people in the house. Joe Smyth has said what happened. Don Dunphy is dead. So we're not getting any more answers there. But everything that happened in the lead up to it, there's lots of questions about that and how we can change things so that doesn't happen again. And everything that happened with the RCMP investigation, where they lost evidence, where there were a few different mistakes made, and real questions about whether they were suitably independent. There's a ton of questions there. So
it leaves issues of trust, of whether or not you can trust the investigation.
next week is going to focus on what actually happened in the House and really pressing Joe Smyth for those answers. But to me, the more interesting and the more productive questions are what happened before and what happened after, so it doesn't happen again.
Right.
And Joe Smyth has been in the hearing room all week, watching the proceedings, sitting behind Jerome Kennedy, his lawyer.
Right, and he'll be testifying, is it for 3 days next week? Yeah, all right. We're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. I want to thank you both very much for joining me here this evening. And of course, people can continue to see your coverage. Of course, it'll be covered on VOCM as well, the Telegram, and we'll, I'm sure, have you back again to discuss this further.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you very much. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the Dunphy inquiry. You can reach us by calling 757-9600. You can email Out of the Fog at rci.rogers.com. And of course, we are all over social media, just like, well, except for James is off of Twitter right now, but most of us anyway are on social media.
We're talking about him on Twitter all the time.
We're talking about him, that's right. Folks, we're going to take a very short break. We'll be right back. Stay with us.